Over the weekend, Jake Paul fought Ben Askren in a boxing match. This was Ben Askren's pro boxing debut, and it was the first real fighter that Jake Paul even fought. And Jake Paul won in the first round, and the MMA community is so salty about it. Which for me, I find it very, very funny because leading up to this fight, Jake Paul has been not just leading up to this fight, but even after he fought Nate Robinson, Jake Paul was calling out Conor McGregor. He was doing a lot of trolling. And one thing about the MMA community is they get really, really hyper defensive. Now, I would consider myself, when you talk about MMA community, you got the fighters, but also the fans. And as a fan, I'm part of that community. But I don't get so overly defensive when somebody's calling out fighters because it's a joke. Like, this person is trolling. He doesn't actually believe he can really get in there with the best of them. But I found it so weird, like leading up to it, how there were like UFC fighters. They were responding on Twitter seriously, like, "Oh man, let me fight him. Oh, he wouldn't stand a chance in MMA." Dude, okay, you can beat somebody in a sport that he's never done. Congratulations. Like that's expected. That is the expected result. And Jake Paul, he trolled these people successfully. And with this fight, because Jake Paul won, there's a lot of saltiness coming from the MMA fighters as well as the fans because I thought that Jake Paul would lose this fight. Obviously he fought Ben Askren, who's a grappler. He's not some elite striker. He never was an elite striker. But when you think about it like this, Ben Askren has been a pro fighter for 10 years, Mixed martial arts, one of the martial arts in mixed martial arts is boxing, So in the 10 years, even though his specialty is grappling, he had to have done a lot of boxing training in these 10 years. So my thing is this, if with 10 years of MMA training, you had to have done a lot of boxing, your boxing should be good enough to take on this YouTuber. I mean, that logically, that's how I see it, And with Jake Paul, he beat Ben Askren, and people are making all kinds of excuses, talking about how, Askren, he had hip surgery. Oh, okay, yeah, he did have hip surgery, but he trains wrestlers. He's still, he's a wrestling coach, and his hips are good enough to get back on the wrestling mat and train with these high school wrestlers. You know what I'm saying? So the hip surgery is not really that big of a deal. People talk about him being retired. Okay, well, take a guy like GSP or Dan Hardy. They've both been retired longer than Ben Askren. And let's just be real. If they were to strictly box, Jake Paul, they both would, mop the floor with Jake Paul. So the excuse about him being retired and hip surgery, to me, it doesn't work. You got to give Jake Paul the credit where credit is due. And I'm no major Jake Paul fan. I find he's funny, but a lot of his stuff is real cringy. At the weigh-ins, he was doing the whole Conor McGregor face and the Conor McGregor stance. That was real weird and cringy, And as far as likability, Ben Askren is a very likable character, very likable person. Now, I've known about him for years, but I have never been a fan of his fighting. Like he always been kind of boring to me. And I remember a few years ago when him and Dana White were going back and forth before he even went to the UFC. Dana White said that Ben Askren is what Ambien takes to go to sleep. And, Ben Askren, his fighting style has never been my favorite. I don't find him entertaining, but I became a fan of his because, he was good at the trash talk. He was good at the mind games. And just in an interview, he had a good personality. Like if you watch him on Joe Rogan Experience, you're like, you could, even if you don't like his fighting, you can still like him as a person. And he's definitely a very likable person. But I'm not about to, give a bunch of excuses as to why he lost. Even some people are saying that Ben Askren, he's a wrestler. He don't come from a striking background. I'm like, okay, as opposed to Jake Paul's extensive boxing record. I mean, come on. If, I think he should have been, I thought that Ben Askren should have won the fight. I think he would have won the fight. But there are several things that took place. For one, he was never the top of the line striker. He was obviously never the best boxer in the MMA community. However, I think that he was even in worse shape than he normally is. He never had abs, but he, this fight, he looked particularly soft. I think he was thinking that, it wouldn't be as difficult. And I think on Jake Paul's part, he was taking it very seriously, putting in a lot of work, eating right, diet. He was taking this very, very seriously, and he's been boxing for 2-3 years now. So you're going to get better doing something a lot for a few years. And I think that Ben Askren just underestimated him a little bit, and he didn't really sharpen up his own boxing skills enough to win the fight. And I forgot what I was going to say, but oh yeah. And I think that he just didn't see Jake Paul giving him a big run for his money, because Jake Paul's, the only people he fought was this guy named Anisan Gibb. He's some Saudi British guy, and he's way small. He had to be 6 inches shorter, maybe 30 pounds lighter than Jake Paul. And then he fought Nate Robinson. And for that fight, I assumed that Nate Robinson would win simply because he's a pro athlete, and neither one of them are high skilled boxers. So I'm assuming that the guy, who's more athletic in that type of situation would win. But it turns out that Jake Paul was a lot more skilled in boxing, even if he's not an elite, he was a lot better than Nate Robinson. And with Ben Askren, I think that even at the weigh-ins, when Ben Askren, they asked him for a prediction, and he said that he predicted a 7th round TKO. This is what he predicted, and for me, I was like, yeah, that's fair. He's not an elite striker, but, he has good cardio, as he's proven in his career. So if the fight goes longer, I assume that Jake Paul will get tired and would get out of there. I thought that maybe Ben Askren would get a late fight TKO, or he would get a unanimous decision, if the fight goes the distance and, Jake Paul would wear himself out. I never saw that Jake Paul would land a big right hand, drop him, and end up getting a TKO victory. Now, a lot of people were saying that this stoppage was too soon. I don't think it was too soon. A lot of the MMA fans are used to guys getting pummeled to a pulp, and every time you turn around in MMA, that was a quick stoppage, that was an early stoppage. So they have a different standard. But the thing about it is, he gets hit with the right hand, he drops, he gets up, and the ref gives him a standing 8 count, right? But when the ref says walk to me, his legs look wobbly. Now, if you get a standing 8 count and your legs are still wobbly, and now in the MMA, there's no standing counts. If you're a little bit wobbly, like the level of wobbly that Ben Askren was, if you were that level in MMA, the fight would still go on. But in boxing, they really don't take any chances. So he was slightly wobbly after the standing 8 count, and the ref stopped it, which was at least something that I would expect to happen. So, so this fight, I'm going to say, I got to give Jake Paul the credit where credit is due. I'm not no major Jake Paul fans, but I find the excuses as to why he won. And, Ben Askren, he's not a real striker. Or he's retired. His hip surgery, I find all of those excuses are laughable, considering he's an MMA fighter of 10 years. And boxing is one of the disciplines of MMA. And he's not no random, he was never no journeyman MMA fighter. I mean, when he came to the UFC, he was 18-0. We're talking a Bellator champion, a ONE champion. So he's a champ in multiple organizations. He really is one. If you're looking at like guys who are elite MMA fighters, and you're thinking about, okay, who was like the best guy not in the UFC? The name that used to come up was guys like Douglas Lima. Nick Diaz's name used to always be up there before he went to the UFC. Hector Lombard and Ben Askren. Ben Askren was also on that list of great guys who haven't made it to the UFC. So this is a legit guy. At his level, he should have good enough boxing. But apparently his boxing wasn't good enough. So look, man, shout out to Ben Askren. He lost the fight fair and square, but he made a major bag. He got more money from this than he did in any of his MMA fights. So that's a good thing. And Jake Paul's stock is rising, and the people are furious that this dude won. They're really, really furious, because it's like, I think there's some level of, I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance, I don't know if that's the proper term, but there's some level of like, this dude who we don't like, he's a clown, he's a goofball, he's a troll, and he's looking like, he's reaching success. He's looking like he's kind of shattering people's perceptions, and I think that's what people really are upset about. So now there's some other MMA fighters who's, they want to take him up and fight him. Tyron Woodley, he's going at Jake Paul, but Woodley and Ben Askren, they've been friends since they were in high school. So I think that's I think it's a little bit personal for him, also because Jake Paul's been a little disrespectful. Mike Perry, who's been going at Jake Paul as well. Now, Mike Perry is a fighter who comes from a boxing background. In fact, I think he had one professional boxing match before he even went into MMA. I think he lost that fight, but either way, if if Jake Paul was to, like, hypothetically, if he was to fight Mike Perry and win, all excuses have to stop about not being a striker, not being good with hands. All those excuses would have to go out the window if he was to fight Mike Perry and win. But I personally don't think he would beat Mike Perry. Mike Perry, he's he's a very tough guy, great chin, he can brawl and everything like that. I think he would pressure Jake Paul, and I think Jake Paul would end up losing that fight. Who else? Now, who Jake Paul called out, I think this fight is very dangerous for him. He called out Nate Diaz, and he said Nate Diaz KO in 3. Now, Nate Diaz did call out him saying he would beat him up earlier, so I don't know if Nate Diaz would take that boxing match, but I think maybe he should, and I really believe Nate Diaz would beat Jake Paul. Now, Jake Paul is not going to I don't think he's going to brutally beat him and knock him out, but with the Diaz brothers, with those triathletes, the way they do those triathlons and their cardio is legendary. I think in this particular fight, with Nate Diaz's boxing skills and cardio, I really think that Jake Paul will get worn out. I truly believe that. He's not knocking out Nate Diaz. At least I highly, highly doubt that. I mean, Nate Diaz's legendary chin, he's been dropped a few times. The only person who stopped him was Josh Thompson with that head kick. He split his forehead open. But I don't think that Jake Paul can beat that guy. Not just that. Nate Diaz's boxing, he's also sparred with, there's no boxer who said Ben Askren was a good boxer. No one ever said that. Whereas Nate Diaz used to train with Andre Ward. Andre Ward, former champion. I can't remember what division he fought in. I think he was 160 something. I'm not very good with boxing divisions, but he's a former champion, and he said the Diaz brothers are good. And he said, he sparred with Nate Diaz, and Nate Diaz knows how to box. Even watch his MMA fights. When Diaz gets to walking people down and throwing the punches, he outboxes anybody. Guys, there's nobody, even in MMA, who was able to box with Nate Diaz. They have, you got to use the leg kicks, take him down. You got to use other things. But when it comes to just boxing, Nate Diaz, he lights everybody up. And I think that he would do the same thing if he fought Jake Paul. But I'm excited. I'm excited because here's this YouTuber who's he's throwing punches to the head and body. He's moving well. At least for me, I'm no boxer, but it looks like he's moving well. I see boxers and it looks like he's doing something similar to what they're doing. So, in my assumption, in my unprofessional, unlicensed opinion, I think he looks pretty good. Yeah, man, I'm excited to see what's next for him. I want to know, how far can he take this? How serious is he? Personally, I think that if he fights an MMA fighter from a striking background, who's good at striking, like a Mike Perry or like a Nate Diaz, and he wins, I think that would really, really solidify him, and people can't make any excuses. I mean, for this fight, I think no one can make excuses. As I've said before, Askren is a 10-year MMA pro. You know what I'm saying? Boxing is one of the disciplines of MMA. And even if you are not a striker in MMA and you use your grappling, you still have to be decent at boxing because every fight starts on the feet. You know what I'm saying? And look at guys like Khabib Nurmagomedov. He came into the UFC. He was terrible at boxing. And then over years, you see his boxing progressively get better. Now, every fight he comes in to grapple. But even in certain fights when he was throwing hands, he dropped Kano with the right hand. When he fought Ali Aquinta, yeah, he dominated on the ground, but significant portions of the fight were on the feet. And Ali Aquinta is considered, if you said where would Ali Aquinta have an advantage against Khabib, people would say, he would have it on the feet. But Khabib won the striking exchanges. He was jabbing him, left hook and right cross. He was on the feet doing well. Look at guys like Chris Weidman. He came in, his hands were complete trash. He was a solid wrestler, but his hands were so trash when he came into the UFC. And then he takes on he fought his debut against Alessio Sakara, trash hands, but then as time progressed, his striking got better. So after all those years, if Ben Askren didn't have the striking good enough to take a guy like Jake Paul, who just started boxing 3 years ago, who's a YouTuber, so I mean, there's really no excuses except that the better man won that night. I think maybe Ben Askren underestimated him a little bit, and he paid for it. But at the end of the day, look, man, they both got money. The fans were entertained. Some people, the MMA community, was very salty about it. All in all, it was a fun time. Okay, I think pretty much that's all. That pretty much covers everything I want to talk about this subject. That's all I had to say about that. If you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you on the next one.